The hidden lore of Skyrim's ancient Nords. When the Nords were not yet Nords, long before Skyrim was a land of jarls, holds, before stone cities clung to mountainsides and banners snapped in the cold wind, there was only ice, sea, and memory. The people who would one day be called Nords did not yet belong to Skyrim at all. They came from Atmora, a northern continent now lost to frost and silence. In the oldest Nordic songs, Atmora is remembered not as a place on a map, but as a state of being, a homeland shaped by endurance, where survival itself was a sacred act. The Atmorans believed that cold was not merely weather, but a trial placed by the gods to measure the worth of a people. This belief shaped everything that followed. In those early days, the Atmorans did not worship their gods as distant rulers. The Nordic pantheon was intimate and immediate. Shor, the warrior god, was not a symbol of abstract creation. He was a fallen leader whose sacrifice gave meaning to struggle itself. Kine was not simply the goddess of the wind, but the breath between life and death, the force that carried voices across battlefields and prayers into the sky. To the ancient Nords, the world did not exist separate from the divine. It existed because of it. This belief explains something crucial about Nordic culture that later ages would misunderstand. The Nords did not fear death in the way other races did. Death was not an ending, but a passage, a final proving ground before Sovngarde. Life was preparation, deeds were currency. When Atmora began to freeze beyond endurance, it was not seen as a disaster, it was seen as a sign. Led by Ysgramor, the Atmorans crossed the Sea of Ghosts in longships that were less vessels of exploration and more rites of passage. These ships were not designed for comfort. They were narrow, exposed, and brutally practical. The journey itself was meant to test those who dared take it. Only those worthy of a new land would survive the crossing. This tells us something important about Nordic society. Leadership was never inherited lightly. A leader was expected to endure what others could not. Strength was not cruelty, but responsibility. When they reached Skyrim, they did not find an empty land. They found the snow elves. At first, there was peace. The snow elves were ancient, refined, deeply tied to magic in the land itself. The Atmorans, by contrast, distrusted magic, not because they lacked it, but because power that could not be carried in one's body and deeds was dangerous. This philosophical divide mattered more than weapons. In Nordic belief, magic was not evil, but it was suspect.
True power was meant to be earned through struggle, not studied in quiet halls. This is why early Nordic magic focused on Thuum, the voice. The voice did not require scrolls or towers. It required breath, will, and understanding of one's place in the world. The voice was not shouting, it was command. Dragons understood this first. The ancient Nords learned the Thuum by listening to dragons, not by mastering spells. This made the voice both sacred and terrifying. To speak with power was to shape reality itself, and thus it was tightly bound to honor. A warrior who abused the voice risked losing Kine's favor, and with it their soul's path to Sovngarde. When the Night of Tears came, and the Snow Elves slaughtered the Atmoran settlers at Sarthal, the ancient Nords did not see it merely as betrayal. They saw it as a cosmic imbalance. Ysgramo's return with the 500 companions was not just revenge, it was ritual correction. War in Nordic culture was a way of restoring order when the world strayed from its rightful shape. This is why Nordic songs rarely describe battles in terms of hatred. They speak instead of duty, remembrance, and grim necessity. As the snow elves were driven into darkness, the Nords began to claim Skyrim, not as conquerors, but as heirs chosen by hardship. Here, the political order of the ancient Nords took form. Unlike later empires, early Nordic rule was not centralized. Power was local, personal, and bound to land. A chieftain ruled because others trusted him to defend the dead as fiercely as the living. Burial mounds were not merely graves, they were anchors of memory, places where the past watched the present. This is why Nordic tombs are filled with traps, draugr, and warding magic. These were not meant to punish the living, they were meant to test them. Only those who approached the dead with respect, strength, and understanding deserved passage. Draugr were not mindless monsters, they were oath-bound guardians, sustained by ancient rites and residual power from the Thu'um. Their presence tells us that the Nords believed duty did not end with death. A warrior could still serve his people long after his heart stopped beating. Windhelm foremost among them, they were built not for beauty, but endurance. Stone over comfort, fire over light, walls thick enough to hold memory itself. And always the wind carried voices. The ancient Nords believed that the land listened, mountains remembered names, rivers knew old oaths. To walk Skyrim was to walk through layers of story, each waiting to be acknowledged. This is the hidden truth of Skyrim's ancient Nords. They were not merely warriors hardened by cold. They were a people who believed that the world itself was alive, and that every step, every breath, every word spoken into the wind would echo beyond a single lifetime. And so they lived carefully, loud in battle, quiet in belief, always aware that the gods were not above them, but around them. Of tombs, oaths, and the long memory of stone. As the centuries passed and the first Atmaran fires became embers buried beneath new snow, the ancient Nords began to understand a truth that would quietly define their civilization. The living were never alone. In Skyrim, the past did not fade. It stood, watched, and sometimes rose. To later generations, Nordic tombs would seem grim, spiraling halls of stone, sealed doors etched with runes, air heavy with dust and old incense. But to the ancient Nords, these places were not morbid. They were homes of continuity, where duty continued uninterrupted. Death, in Nordic belief, did not dissolve identity, it refined it. When a warrior died honorably, their soul did not simply depart. A part of their will remained bound to the bones, armor, and weapons they had carried in life. This bond was not accidental. It was shaped through funerary rites, spoken chants, and careful placement within the tomb. The goal was never resurrection, it was preservation of purpose. This is how the draugr came to be. Contrary to how they appear to wandering adventurers, draugr were not created through necromancy. The ancient Nords despised necromancy as an unnatural violation of kind's breath. Draugr arose instead from a sacred contradiction, a warrior's duty enduring longer than flesh was meant to last. Some draugr were kings, buried with dragon claws and word walls, entrusted with guarding fragments of the voice itself. Others were lesser warriors, sworn to protect passageways, relics, or the memory of an oath once taken. Their withered forms were sustained not by spells, but residual thoom, echoes of spoken power lingering in stone and bone. This reveals a deeper system at work in the Nordic world. Words were not fleeting. Spoken with intent, they shaped reality and lingered long after the speaker fell silent. Word walls carved into cliff faces and tomb chambers were not instructional tools in the modern sense, they were anchors. Each word was bound to a place because meaning to the Nords required context. Power spoken without grounding was dangerous. Power bound to stone was stable. This is why the ancient graybeards would later isolate themselves atop the throat of the world. The mountain itself acted as restraint. The higher one climbed, the quieter one was meant to become. But long before the graybeards withdrew from the world, the voice was not reserved for monks. In early Nordic society, the thoom was a martial tradition. Chieftains used it to command, not dominate. Warriors used it to strike, but sparingly. To misuse the voice was to risk tearing oneself apart, body and spirit unable to contain the weight of the words spoken. Those who mastered the voice too eagerly often vanished from history, not erased, but unfinished. This fear shaped Nordic politics. Unlike the later Cyrodiilic empires, ancient Nordic rule was decentralized by necessity. Power pooled around individuals, not institutions. A high king existed, but his authority depended on consent, reputation, and lineage proven through deed. Jarls were not administrators, they were guardians of memory, responsible for holding together land, people, and the honored dead beneath their feet. Each hold developed its own traditions, shaped by geography and ancient pacts. The people of the Reach, living among jagged stone and hostile terrain, developed harsher customs and looser ties to the Nordic pantheon. In contrast, the eastern holds, closer to Windhelm, clung fiercely to Atmoran traditions, preserving rites long abandoned elsewhere. This fragmentation was not weakness, it was balance. The Nords believed that a land too unified forgot its roots. Diversity of custom ensured that no single failure could doom the whole. Even civil conflict was not entirely taboo. It was seen as a painful, sometimes necessary recalibration. And always, beneath every hall and hearth, lay the tombs. Children grew up knowing that their ancestors slept below them. Not metaphorically, literally. Villages were built near burial mounds on purpose. The presence of the dead offered protection, guidance, and silent judgment. To act dishonorably was not only to shame oneself, but to disturb the peace of those who still listened. This closeness to death shaped Nordic temperament. Calm acceptance replaced fear. Grief was real, but it was tempered by certainty. A warrior lost in battle was not gone. He was ahead, waiting in Sovngarde, sharpening his blade beneath Shore's gaze. This belief system functioned as a moral engine. There was no need for elaborate laws when honor itself was enforced by cosmic consequence. Cowardice echoed, courage endured. Even the land responded to this worldview. Skyrim's harsh climate was not merely endured, it was interpreted. Blizzards were seen as Kind's breath made visible. Avalanches were reminders of humility. Survival was communion. To live in Skyrim was to be in constant conversation with the world. And so the ancient Nords did not seek to tame the land, they sought to listen to it. As generations passed and dragons would one day rise and fall, this deep-rooted relationship between people, death, and voice would be tested, stretched to its breaking point, because there would come a time when words would no longer be enough,
when the dragons returned not as teachers, but as tyrants, when the voice itself would need to be redefined. When dragons ruled the sky and mortals learned to kneel, there came a time when the wind no longer felt like a companion, it watched. In the oldest Nordic laments, the age of dragons is remembered not with sudden terror, but with a slow tightening of the world. At first, the dragons were teachers, vast, patient beings whose understanding of the voice surpassed anything mortals could imagine. To learn from them was considered a blessing. To hear a dragon speak was to feel the bones of the world vibrate. But knowledge, when unbalanced, does not remain gentle. The dragons did not rule Skyrim by armies or borders, they ruled by authority of language. In the dragon tongue, words did not describe reality, they declared it. When a dragon spoke, the world aligned itself accordingly. This was not magic in the scholarly sense, it was a cosmic hierarchy embedded into the fabric of existence. At the top of this hierarchy stood Alduin, not merely the greatest dragon, but the embodiment of an ending. The ancient Nords did not initially understand him as a villain, they understood him as inevitable. Alduin was not destruction for its own sake, he was the turning of the great cycle, the moment when one age made way for the next. This distinction mattered deeply, because beneath Alduin, the other dragons began to shape Skyrim into something the Nords had never known, a land ruled not by shared memory, but by fear of command. Thus emerged the dragon cult. The cult was not imposed overnight. It grew quietly through reverence that hardened into obedience. Dragon priests were chosen from among the Nords themselves, individuals who demonstrated loyalty, ambition, and a willingness to surrender personal honor for proximity to power. This tells us something crucial about how ancient Nordic society could fracture. Honor was central, but it was not immune to temptation. The dragon cult exploited a weakness the Nords rarely acknowledged, the desire to be chosen, to stand closer to the gods, to be remembered not just by one's kin, but by history itself. Dragon priests wore masks not merely as symbols, but as anchors of authority. Each mask was bound to a dragon patron, infused with power that extended life far beyond its natural span. These were not blessings given freely, they were contracts. The longer a priest ruled, the more their identity eroded until only the role remained. This is why dragon priests, when encountered long after their age has passed, feel hollow. They are not truly undead in the Nordic sense, they are unresolved, kept standing by oaths that were never released. Here we see a fundamental contrast between Nordic and Draconic worldviews. To the Nords, power was earned through struggle and then released through death. To dragons, power was inherent, eternal, and meant to dominate. As the dragon cult tightened its grip, everyday life in Skyrim changed. Villages paid tribute not to jarls, but to distant priests. The voice, once a tool of communal defense and ritual, became restricted. Mortals were forbidden to speak certain words. The breath of kine was regulated. This restriction was more than political, it was spiritual suffocation. And yet, resistance did not rise immediately. The ancient Nords endured, they always had. They believed hardship was a test, and tests were meant to be survived. But this time, survival came at the cost of identity. Children grew up fearing the sky, songs were softened, names were spoken carefully, the land itself seemed to recoil. It was during this age that the Nords began to reinterpret their gods. Shor, once the fallen king, became a symbol of defiance. Kine, once the wind, became the whisper of rebellion. The gods had not left them, but they no longer answered openly. This is how belief evolves under pressure. And in the quiet spaces between fear and faith, a realization took root. If dragons ruled through the voice, then the voice could be reclaimed. This realization did not emerge from scholars or kings. It came from mortal limits, from throats that bled,
from breaths that shattered stone but broke bodies in the process. Mortals were never meant to wield the voice as dragons did, but that did not mean they could not adapt it. Here begins one of the most important systems in Nordic history, the separation of the voice from dominion. Those who would later be remembered as tongues began to use the thumb not to rule, but to resist. Their words were not commands imposed from above, but cries shaped by shared will. This difference changed everything. When many voices aligned in purpose, the voice became something dragons could not fully control. The land listened again. Mountains echoed not with decrees, but with defiance. Rivers carried new names, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world leaned back toward balance. The Dragon War did not begin with a single battle. It began with a change in how mortals understood themselves. They were no longer students, they were no longer subjects, they were voices. The war of voices and the breaking of the old order. The Dragon War did not arrive with a declaration, it arrived as a shift in sound. Where once the skies thundered with unquestioned authority, now there were moments of hesitation, beats of silence where dragons expected obedience and received only stillness. The ancient Nords had begun to understand something subtle yet dangerous. Power rooted in fear depends on being believed, and belief can fracture. The first uprisings were small, a village refusing tribute, a dragon priest's summons unanswered, a shrine left uncleaned. These acts were not loud, but they were deliberate. In Nordic culture, such refusals carried weight. To ignore an obligation was to challenge the order that demanded it. The dragons responded as they always had, through force. Fire fell from the sky, not as punishment, but as reminder. Villages were erased, names were lost, yet something had changed. Where once devastation broke the spirit, now it hardened it. The Nords had lived with death for generations. They did not fear it. What they feared was living without meaning. This is where the tongues truly emerged. Not as generals, not as kings, but as focal points. Individuals whose mastery of the voice came not from domination, but from restraint. They learned that the thum was not strengthened by shouting louder, but by understanding deeper. Each word carried history, each syllable demanded alignment between breath, intent, and place. This is why the tongues trained in isolation, not because the world rejected them, but because they needed distance from it. Mountains, caves, and high plateaus became places of quiet preparation. The land itself shaped their voices. A shout learned in a narrow pass carried differently than one shaped beside an open sea. Here we see an important system at work. The voice was contextual. It was not a universal weapon. It was a conversation between speaker and world. The Nords learned to fight dragons not by overpowering them, but by unsettling the hierarchy that sustained them. When enough mortals spoke with shared purpose, even dragons hesitated. Their certainty faltered. Authority, once absolute, became strained, and in that strain, vulnerability appeared. The Dragon War unfolded over years, perhaps decades. Time loses clarity in oral histories shaped by song and firelight. What remains consistent is not chronology, but transformation. Dragons fell, not because mortals became stronger, but because the world itself no longer answered dragons alone. Dragon priests fought desperately to maintain order. Their masks, once symbols of divine favor, became prisons. Bound by oaths that demanded obedience, they could not retreat, could not adapt. When their dragons fell, the priests remained, undying, unresolved, sealed away in tombs that mirrored their own stagnation. This sealing was not mercy, it was containment. The ancient Nords did not destroy what they did not fully understand, they buried it. They placed it behind stone doors and rune locks, trusting future generations to approach with caution. This practice reveals a profound cultural truth. The Nords accepted that not all problems could be solved in one age. Some were meant to wait. The war reached its turning point when the Nords confronted Alduin himself. They did not defeat him in battle. That would have violated the very order they sought to restore. Alduin was not meant to die, not yet. Instead, they did something unprecedented. With the aid of elder knowledge and mortal desperation, they removed him from time. This act was not triumph, it was compromise. By casting Alduin forward, the Nords acknowledged their limits. They preserved the cycle without submitting to it. This decision reshaped Nordic belief forever. The gods were powerful, but not infallible. Mortals mattered, not as rulers, but as participants in the world's unfolding. When the Dragon War ended, Skyrim was quieter. Too quiet. The dragons were gone, but so was the clarity they had imposed. Without a single dominant force, the ancient Nords had to relearn how to govern themselves. Jarls reclaimed authority, but the scars of the cult lingered. Trust was fragile, memory heavy, and the voice changed. No longer a weapon of war, it became something to fear again, but for different reasons. The devastation wrought by uncontrolled tongues had reshaped landscapes. Valleys collapsed, cities cracked. The Nords understood then that even justified power could become catastrophic if left unchecked. This realization gave rise to restraint. Those who would become the Greybeards withdrew from the world, carrying with them the last disciplined understanding of the Thu'um. They did not abandon the Nords, they preserved something dangerous until the world was ready again. The ancient Nords accepted this loss with grim wisdom. They had seen what happens when power lingers too long in mortal hands. And so Skyrim entered a new age, not of peace, but of watchful balance. The tombs remained sealed. The mountains kept their silence. The wind still carried echoes, but now it waited to be answered. After the silence, memory as law and the weight of the past. When the last echoes of the Dragon War faded into the mountains, Skyrim did not celebrate, it listened. The sky, once crowded with wings and fire, became vast and empty. For the first time in generations, the ancient Nords lived beneath a silence that felt unfamiliar, almost uneasy. Dragons had been tyrants, yes, but they had also been a constant. Their absence left a hollow space in the world's order. Into that space stepped memory. Without dragons to fear and without gods speaking openly, the Nords turned inward. They began to build a society not guided by prophecy or divine command, but by remembrance. What had been learned through suffering was not allowed to fade. Stories hardened into customs. Customs became law. This is how Nordic tradition truly formed, not in triumph, but in restraint. Jarls resumed their roles, yet their authority changed. No longer could a leader claim divine favor through proximity to dragons or priests. Power now rested on lineage, yes, but more importantly, on reputation preserved across generations. A Jarl ruled because his ancestors had ruled well, and because his actions would be judged not only by the living, but by the dead beneath the land. Here we see the emergence of a uniquely Nordic political system, ancestral legitimacy. Unlike later empires that relied on written codes and centralized bureaucracy, the ancient Nords relied on continuity. Law was remembered, not recorded. Oaths were spoken aloud, witnessed by kin, land, and spirit. To break an oath was not merely a crime, it was a fracture in the chain of memory that held society together. This explains why Nordic justice appears harsh to outsiders. Punishments were not designed for rehabilitation, they were designed for restoration.
Exile, for example, was considered worse than death. To be cast from one's land was to be removed from the story itself. A person without a place had no ancestors to answer to, no descendants to carry their name. Even execution, when it occurred, was ritualized. Death was not inflicted casually. It was shaped, acknowledged, and concluded with care. The soul's path mattered more than the body's end. Religion, too, changed quietly. The Nordic gods did not vanish, but they grew distant. Shore remained present in story and song, more symbol than voice. Kine was still felt in the wind, but she no longer guided armies. Worship became domestic, woven into daily life rather than monumental temples. Hearths replaced shrines, names replaced idols. This shift created a deep divide between the Nords and other races, especially the elves. To the elves, memory was preserved through writing, architecture, and magic. To the Nords, memory lived in speech. A story retold was alive. A story carved into stone was finished. This difference explains why Nordic ruins feel abandoned, while elven ruins feel frozen in time. The Nords did not abandon their past, they carried it forward. This era also reshaped their relationship with magic. The trauma of the Dragon War left a lasting suspicion. Magic was not banned, but it was narrowed. Practical enchantments survived, wards for protection, runes for boundaries, but expansive arcane study faded. The voice, once central to Nordic identity, became something to avoid mentioning openly, not forgotten, contained. The graybeards, high upon the throat of the world, became living reminders of restraint. Their isolation was respected, not resented.
The Nords understood that some knowledge was too heavy for everyday life. To ask the graybeards for guidance was to admit desperation, and desperation carried consequence. Meanwhile, the tombs remained sealed yet active. Draugr still walked their patrols in darkness. Word walls still whispered to stone. These were not relics of a failed age. They were locks, systems designed to ensure that the past could not be misused easily. This is why Skyrim feels layered. Every road crosses older paths. Every city sits atop something buried. The ancient Nords deliberately built this way. They believed that forgetting made repetition inevitable. By forcing future generations to literally walk over history, they ensured constant reminder. But memory, when carried too long, grows heavy. As centuries passed, the ancient clarity began to blur. Songs shortened, names softened. Some stories became myths, others warnings without context. The balance the Nords had achieved was fragile, dependent on continuous remembering. And memory, like stone, erodes. It was in this slow erosion that new tensions would arise, between old ways and new influences, between isolation and empire, between the cold certainty of tradition and the warmer promises of change. The ancient Nords did not see these changes as betrayal. They saw them as tests of whether their way of life, built on silence, memory, and restraint, could survive a world that no longer feared the sky. When the world came knocking, and Skyrim answered slowly. Change did not arrive in Skyrim with banners or thunder. It arrived as footsteps, merchants from the south first, envoys carrying unfamiliar titles, soldiers who spoke of order, unity, and roads that stretched farther than memory could comfortably hold. The ancient Nords watched all of this with quiet caution, not hostility. They had learned long ago that sudden rejection was as dangerous as blind acceptance. This was not the first time outsiders had come, but it was the first time they came to stay. The rise of the Cyrodiilic empires introduced a system of power utterly unlike the Nordic way.
Where the Nords trusted memory, the Empire trusted record. Where Nordic law lived in oaths and reputation, imperial law lived in scrolls, seals, and standardized judgment. To the Empire, stability meant uniformity. To the Nords, it meant continuity. Neither side was wrong, but they were incompatible. The ancient Nords did not resist the Empire with immediate war. That too would have been a mistake. Instead, they practiced something far subtler: selective adoption. Roads were accepted, trade was welcomed, coin replaced barter in some regions, but belief, burial, and identity remained untouched, at least at first. Imperial governance brought with it a new political system, central authority mediated by law rather than lineage. Jarls retained their titles, but their power slowly bent toward imperial oversight. This shift unsettled the ancient balance. A Jarl who answered to distant rulers no longer stood solely as guardian of local memory, and memory noticed. Nordic elders began to speak of a feeling they could not easily name, not fear, not anger, something quieter, a sense that the land was being asked to remember too many things at once. Old burial sites were disturbed to make way for roads. Ancient stones were catalogued rather than revered. To the Empire, this was progress. To the Nords, it felt like interruption. Religion became the fault line. The imperial pantheon reinterpreted the Nordic gods, smoothing their rough edges, folding shore into more acceptable forms, softening kind's wildness. In doing so, they offered unity, but at the cost of local meaning. A god understood everywhere was a god deeply understood nowhere. This shift explains why Nordic worship grew more private, even stubborn. Shrines hidden in forests, offerings left quietly at standing stones, names spoken under breath rather than proclaimed. The Nords were not rejecting the Empire's gods, they were protecting their own relationships with them. Magic, too, changed tone. Imperial mages brought structure, institutions, and confidence. The College of Winterhold, once aligned closely with Nordic restraint, slowly drifted toward broader arcane traditions. This deepened the old suspicion. Magic that traveled easily was magic that could be misused easily. The ancient fear returned, not of magic itself, but of losing context. And yet, Skyrim did not fracture. This resilience reveals something essential about the ancient Nords. They understood endurance better than purity. They did not cling to the past unchanged, they carried it forward selectively, allowing outer layers to shift while protecting the core. That core was still honor, memory, and place. Families continued to trace lineage through spoken history. Tombs remained sacred. Draugr were still avoided, not out of fear but respect. The graybeards were still left undisturbed, their silence a reminder that some truths should not be summoned casually. Even imperial soldiers stationed in Skyrim began to feel it, a heaviness, a sense that the land expected something from them. Skyrim did not reject newcomers, but it demanded patience. Those who rushed were unsettled. Those who listened endured. This is why Skyrim absorbs cultures rather than dissolving into them. The ancient Nords had built their world not as a monument, but as a living weight. To exist there was to carry it, whether one understood it or not. But beneath this slow adaptation, something stirred. As generations passed, the stories of dragons became distant. The Dragon War softened into legend. Alduin became myth rather than memory. And with that fading came danger, not from invasion, but from forgetting why restraint had ever mattered. The tombs were still sealed, the word walls still waited, the wind still carried old names, but fewer people recognized the echoes. And when a culture built on memory begins to forget, the past does not vanish, it waits. When old things wake and the land remembers, first. For a long while Skyrim slept, not the sleep of peace,
but the sleep of something vast and patient, like a mountain beneath snow, unchanged yet never truly still. The ancient Nords had built their world to endure forgetting, but they had never believed forgetting would be harmless. They believed it would be answered. The first signs were subtle. Tombs once sealed without incident began to stir more often. Draugr grew restless, not because they hungered for life, but because their purpose was being disturbed. Burial doors were opened by curious hands that did not know the names spoken when those stones were first laid. Word walls were approached as puzzles, not vows. The dead noticed. This reveals an often overlooked truth about Nordic tombs. They were not merely defensive structures, they were reactive systems. Each tomb was bound to the living world through maintenance of memory. Offerings, avoidance, and respect acted as stabilizers. When these faded, the ancient mechanisms did not fail, they activated. The Draugr were never meant to roam freely. Their patrols were inward-facing, guarding against misuse of what lay deeper. But when the outer layers of meaning eroded, the Guardians responded by extending their vigilance. What modern travelers see as aggression is in truth escalation, the past defending itself. At the same time, the land itself began to speak more loudly. Nordic belief had always held that Skyrim was not passive terrain. Mountains were witnesses. Rivers were carriers of memory. Snow preserved more than bodies, it preserved intent. When the people forgot how to listen, the land adjusted its volume. Avalanches came where paths had grown careless. Storms lingered longer than expected. Ruins emerged from melting ice, exposing carvings no one remembered placing there. These were not punishments, they were reminders. And then, slowly, the old structures of power began to realign. Jarls found themselves drawn back toward ancestral claims. Lineage mattered again, not out of pride, but necessity. In times of uncertainty, the Nords instinctively sought continuity. They asked not who promised the future, but who remembered the past. This shift reveals a deep political mechanism embedded in Nordic culture. Authority returns to memory when progress falters. Even the Greybeards felt the change. High upon the throat of the world, their meditations grew heavier. The mountain, once content with silence, began to resonate again. This was not the return of the dragons yet, but the loosening of the seals placed long ago. The voice, bound and restrained, stirred like a held breath nearing release. The Greybeards did not interpret this as destiny. They interpreted it as consequence. When the voice is forgotten as discipline, it reemerges as disruption. Meanwhile, the dragon cult's remnants, long dormant, grew restless. The priests, sealed away and unresolved, felt the weakening of the structures that bound them. Their masks, once inert, began to hum with faint echoes of allegiance long denied. They did not awaken because they were summoned. They awakened because they were remembered incorrectly. To treat a dragon priest as a monster is to misunderstand him. He is not a creature of chaos. He is a fragment of an abandoned order, still obeying commands that no longer apply. When modern hands disturb their tombs without understanding the oaths involved, the priests respond exactly as they were designed to, with enforcement. This is why Skyrim's ancient evils never feel random. They are procedural. They arise when rules are broken, not laws written on paper, but agreements written into the structure of the world. The Nords once knew this intuitively. As these old systems reactivated, a quiet unease spread across Skyrim. Not panic, not rebellion, a sense of being watched, not by gods, but history itself. Elders spoke more often of the old stories. Parents began teaching children names long absent from common speech. Memory began to heal itself. But healing is not gentle. To remember fully is to reopen wounds. The Nords would soon be forced to confront truths they had softened over time. The dragons were not only tyrants, that the voice was not only weapon, and that restraint, once lost, demands cost to regain. The world was preparing not for destruction, but for reckoning. Something ancient was aligning its breath with the present age, not to rule, not to punish, but to restore a balance disrupted by forgetting. And when balance shifts, it seeks a fulcrum. Of destiny resisted, and the voice returned carefully. Skyrim had never trusted destiny. The ancient Nords believed that fate was not a path laid out in advance, but a pressure that built when choices went unanswered. Prophecy, to them, was not guidance, it was warning. Something spoken too clearly was something that could be misunderstood, or worse, obeyed without thought. And yet, the signs grew impossible to ignore. The wind changed its cadence. The graybeards spoke names again, softly at first, then with growing certainty. Old words, long dormant, stirred in the air, not as commands, but as invitations. The voice, once sealed away through discipline, began to return to the world, not through institutions, but through individuals. This is how the ancient Nords understood the re-emergence of a dragonborn. Not as a chosen ruler, not as a divine replacement, but as a pressure valve. The world, strained by forgotten systems and waking remnants, required someone capable of bearing the weight of the voice without being consumed by it. The Dragonborn was not an answer to prophecy. He or she was a response to imbalance. This interpretation aligns perfectly with Nordic cosmology. The gods do not intervene to fix what mortals break. They intervene to prevent the world from breaking entirely. Alduin's return, long delayed, was not punishment. It was the cycle asserting itself after restraint had stretched too far. The difference now was context. The Dragonborn emerged into a Skyrim layered with memory, restraint, and consequence. Unlike the ancient tongues who wielded the voice collectively, the Dragonborn carried it alone, but with inherited caution. The Greybeards did not train out of ambition, they tested for humility. This reveals a critical system within Nordic spirituality. Power is not validated by strength, but by willingness to refuse it. The Greybeards taught not how to shout, but how to listen. Each word learned was paired with silence. Each ability carried the implicit question, should this be used? This philosophy directly contrasts with the Dragon Cult's doctrine, where power existed to be exercised continuously. The ancient Nords, having lived through the consequences of that belief, had designed safeguards. The Greybeards were one, the tombs another, the cultural suspicion of magic yet another. Together, these formed a web of restraint. As dragons returned, their presence felt different than before. They were no longer unchallenged authorities. The world no longer answered them automatically. Mortals had learned to speak back, not recklessly, but deliberately. The voice had changed because the relationship had changed. Dragons still embodied dominance, but they no longer defined meaning. Their language could be learned, adapted, and, crucially, answered. This subtle shift explains why dragons, once invincible rulers, could now be resisted without unraveling reality itself. The ancient Nords had succeeded, across millennia, in reshaping the cosmic hierarchy, not by overthrowing it, but by participating in it. And yet, the cost remained. Each time the voice was used carelessly, the land responded. Each tomb disturbed without understanding, the dead answered. Each old oath forgotten, a fragment of the past reasserted itself. Skyrim did not punish, it corrected. This is why the world feels alive in moments of crisis, because it is. The ancient systems never shut down, they waited. What modern eyes see as chaos, the rise of dragons, the awakening of ancient evils, the stirring of forgotten powers, is, in truth, maintenance, a civilization built on memory correcting drift. The Nords had always believed that the greatest danger was not invasion or fire, but forgetting why things were done a certain way. Now, remembering came with consequence. The Dragonborn stood at the intersection of ages, not to replace the old, but to carry it forward once more. To speak when silence failed, to remain silent when power tempted. This balance was never meant to last forever, only long enough. Long enough for the world to breathe. When a people become a presence, by the time the world learned new names for old forces, the ancient Nords were already gone. Not vanished, not erased, simply diffused. They no longer existed as a single voice speaking through kings, tongues, or dragon slayers.
Instead, they became something quieter and far more enduring. They became pattern. You can feel this if you walk Skyrim slowly, in the way paths curve instead of cutting straight through land, in the way homes are built low and heavy as if apologizing to the wind, in the way silence is allowed to exist without being filled. This is the final evolution of Nordic identity. After ages of gods walking openly, dragons ruling the sky, empires reshaping borders, and prophecy stirring uneasily, the ancient Nords learned the last lesson their world demanded of them. A civilization does not endure by speaking forever. It endures by knowing when to fall quiet. The political structures of old Skyrim faded into something simpler. Jarls remained, but their authority softened. Councils mattered more than crowns. Local knowledge outweighed distant decree. This was not regression, it was adaptation. The Nords had learned that centralized power invited imbalance, so they spread weight instead of stacking it. This is why Skyrim feels resistant to absolute rule. Every attempt, dragon, priest, emperor, eventually slows, sinks, or fractures. The land itself favors distributed memory. No single voice carries everything. Everyone carries something. Even conflict follows this pattern. Civil wars arise not because Skyrim is unstable, but because it refuses to settle too neatly into one shape. Tension is allowed to exist. Disagreement is not failure, it is circulation. The ancient Nords understood that a world without friction stagnates. This philosophy extends even to how ruins are treated. Nordic ruins are not restored. They are not preserved behind glass. They are left exposed, weathered, and dangerous. This is intentional. A ruin that cannot harm you cannot teach you. A past that feels safe is a past already misunderstood. The ancient Nords believed that memory should carry risk. This is why their architecture remains harsh, their tombs unwelcoming, their stories unresolved. They did not want descendants who felt comfortable around power they had not earned. Even Sovngarde reflects this belief. To outsiders, it seems like a reward. To the Nords, it is continuation. The hall is not paradise, it is responsibility extended beyond death. Feasting, fighting, remembering. No final rest, only belonging sustained through action. This reveals the deepest truth of Nordic spirituality. Rest is not stillness. Rest is right placement.
To be at rest is to be where you are meant to be, doing what you are meant to do, surrounded by those who share the same understanding. The ancient Nords did not seek peace as absence of struggle. They sought peace as alignment. And alignment, once achieved, does not need constant attention. So they stepped back. They let the voice pass into legend. They let dragons become myth. They let gods become stories told at hearths rather than commands shouted from skies. What remained was subtler but stronger, a land that listens, a people who remember without recording, a culture that teaches by allowing mistakes to hurt but not destroy. This is why Skyrim never feels empty, even when no one speaks. Because the ancient Nords are not gone. They are in the way snow covers footprints but not paths, in the way storms arrive without warning yet leave space for rebuilding, in the way the past is never fully buried, only quieted. They became what they always believed mattered most. Not rulers, not heroes, not voices shouting into eternity, but witnesses. And witnesses do not need to speak loudly, they only need to remain. The quiet work of living and how the old ways persist. Long after the great names faded from common speech, after dragons became stories told to children who half believed them, the ancient Nords continued their work in a quieter form. They lived. This may seem simple, but to the Nords, living was never passive. It was a practice, one shaped by attention, restraint, and a steady respect for limits. In villages scattered across tundra and forest, daily life carried the same philosophy that once governed wars and gods. Consider the hearth. In Nordic homes, the hearth was not merely a place of warmth. It was the spiritual center of the household, a controlled fire meant to echo the greater forces of the world. Fire was power made useful. Left unattended, it destroyed. Tended carefully, it sustained. Children learned this lesson before they learned stories of Shore or Sovngarde. This is how beliefs survived without temples. Food was prepared with intention. Meat honored the animal that gave it. Bones were not discarded carelessly. Even tools were treated with a kind of respect, not sentimentality, but acknowledgement. An axe that failed was not cursed, it was understood to have reached the end of its service. This worldview reveals a fundamental system of Nordic thought. Nothing exists without obligation. To take was to owe. To use was to maintain. To inherit was to remember. Seasonal rhythms reinforced this understanding. The ancient Nords marked time not by calendars, but by patterns of readiness. Winter was not an interruption, it was a proving season. Stores were checked, roofs reinforced, relationships tested. Those who survived winter together trusted each other more deeply than any oath could enforce. Community, in this sense, was practical spirituality. Even conflict followed ritual patterns. Disputes were often settled publicly with witnesses because truth mattered less than shared understanding. A resolved conflict strengthened memory. A hidden one rotted quietly. This is why the Nords distrusted secrecy more than violence. Violence was visible. Secrecy fractured continuity. The old suspicion of magic also softened into something more precise. Magic used openly, with clear purpose and communal awareness, was tolerated. Healing, protection, weather reading, these were extensions of living attentively. But magic practiced in isolation, without accountability, stirred unease. The ancient Nords had learned that power without witnesses drifted. This is also why bards held such importance. They were not entertainers in the modern sense, they were custodians of alignment. A song corrected memory, a tale adjusted emphasis. A poorly told story could distort history, and distortion, left unchecked, became danger. So stories were repeated often, not word for word, but truth for truth. Children learned early that forgetting was natural, but negligence was not. Elders corrected gently, not to shame, but to anchor. This method allowed tradition to breathe. It changed without losing shape, and beneath it all, the land continued to respond. Paths worn by careful travel remained safe. Trails rushed became treacherous. Camps built with respect endured better than those built quickly. These were not superstitions. They were accumulated observations, carried forward as quiet rules. Skyrim taught constantly. The ancient Nords listened not because they were humble, but because listening had kept them alive. Over time, this practice became instinct. Even newcomers felt it, an urge to slow down, to watch the weather longer than necessary, to choose placement carefully. This is how a culture persists without enforcement, not through command, through atmosphere. And atmosphere, once established, is difficult to erase. As generations continued to pass and as new conflicts rose and fell, this quiet work of living remained. It did not solve every problem. It did not prevent suffering, but it ensured that suffering did not sever meaning from existence. The ancient Nords understood that the world would never be stable. So they built themselves to be. How Skyrim chooses, and the last test of belonging. Skyrim has never asked for loyalty. It asks for attentiveness. Those who arrive believing they must conquer the land quickly feel this first. Their steps grow heavy. Their plans unravel. Storms seem poorly timed. Paths vanish beneath sudden snow. To such travelers, Skyrim appears hostile, even cruel. But this is misunderstanding. The ancient Nords believed that a land, like a person, reveals itself only after being approached correctly. Rushing was a form of disrespect. Expectation was a kind of arrogance. To belong, one had to learn the rhythm already in place. This is the last system the ancient Nords left behind, belonging through adaptation. No ritual granted it, no document confirmed it. It was earned slowly, through response rather than assertion. Those who learned to wait before building, to observe before speaking, to follow existing paths before carving new ones, these were accepted, almost invisibly. The land softened around them. Winter became manageable. Neighbors spoke more freely. Work found its place. This was not superstition. It was pattern recognition shaped into culture. The Nords themselves had once been outsiders. They had crossed the sea of ghosts not because they desired conquest, but because they were willing to endure what the crossing demanded. Skyrim had accepted them because they arrived changed by the journey. And that expectation never left. This is why Skyrim absorbs cultures unevenly. Some influences root deeply, others remain surface-bound, never fully integrating. The land does not reject difference, it rejects disregard. Even the ruins participate in this judgment. Many who enter Nordic tombs with greed or haste do not leave, not because the dead are malicious, but because the living failed the first test, recognizing that they were guests. Those who move slowly, who read the carvings, who sense when to retreat, often pass unchallenged through places others find lethal. The ancient Nords designed their defenses to evaluate intent as much as strength. This is also why the greatest dangers in Skyrim are rarely sudden. They announce themselves gradually. A sense of wrongness, a tightening of air, a moment when instinct says pause. Those who listen survive. Those who press forward out of pride do not. Skyrim does not ambush. It waits. Over time, this waiting becomes trust. A person who endures enough winters, who buries their dead properly, who respects what cannot be immediately understood, begins to feel something subtle shift. The land does not welcome them, but it no longer resists them. This is acceptance in the Nordic sense. Not warmth, not praise, permission. The ancient Nords believed this was the highest form of belonging, to be allowed to exist without constant correction, to move without friction, to be unremarkable in the best possible way. Heroes in this worldview were temporary necessities. They arose when imbalance grew too severe to correct quietly, but they were never meant to define the culture. Once their work was done, they faded back into the pattern, or were expected to. This is why Skyrim remembers deeds but rarely preserves comfort. Comfort dulls awareness. Awareness preserves balance. And balance, once learned, must be maintained personally. The ancient Nords did not expect their descendants to live as they had lived. They expected them to listen as they had listened, to accept that certainty is fleeting, that power must be handled sparingly, and that the land always notices intent before action. This is the final inheritance. Not a throne, not a weapon, not even a story told clearly, but a quiet understanding that belonging is not claimed. It is granted, slowly, conditionally, and never permanently. Skyrim still waits, and those who wish to remain must learn to wait with it. What remains when nothing needs proving? There comes a moment, rarely marked and never announced, when a culture stops asking whether it will endure. The ancient Nords reached this moment quietly. It did not arrive with victory or revelation, but with repetition. Seasons passed as they always had. Children grew into adults who already knew the rules without being taught them explicitly. Elders corrected less often, not because standards had fallen, but because understanding had settled deeper. This is what it means for a way of life to succeed. By this age, the ancient Nords no longer spoke of themselves as ancient. They did not frame their lives in contrast to dragons, empires, or gods. Those comparisons belonged to earlier centuries, when identity still needed edges. Now, identity had softened into habit, and habit, when aligned, requires no defense. The land reflected this shift. Skyrim's dangers did not disappear, but they became predictable to those who listened. Storms followed patterns. Wildlife respected boundaries that were honored. Even conflict felt contained, flaring and settling without consuming everything around it. This reveals another quiet system the ancient Nords had shaped: self-correcting balance. They had learned through long suffering that stability enforced from above eventually collapses. Stability maintained through countless small adjustments does not.
When something went wrong, it was addressed locally. When a tradition no longer fit, it bent rather than broke. This flexibility is why Nordic culture survived pressures that erased others. The Dwemer vanished through certainty taken too far. The snow elves fractured through loss and desperation. The dragon cult calcified through obedience without reflection. The Nords endured because they allowed doubt, not doubt of purpose, but doubt of method. They asked whether something still served its role, and when it did not, they allowed it to fade without ceremony. Even their relationship with the gods reflected this maturity. Worship did not end, it deepened. The gods were no longer appealed to constantly, they were trusted. A prayer offered rarely but sincerely carried more weight than 100 shouted pleas. The gods, in turn, became quieter, not absent, but content. This mutual quiet was a sign of alignment. The ancient Nords believed that when the gods speak too often, something is wrong. Either mortals are not listening or the world is out of balance. Silence, therefore, was not neglect, it was confirmation. Sovngarde itself became less central in daily thought, not because it was doubted, but because it no longer needed emphasis. A life lived correctly did not require constant reassurance about what came after. This acceptance softened the fear of death further. Loss still hurt, but it did not destabilize. The living carried on, not because they were hardened, but because stopping would dishonor the continuity they were entrusted with. And so the ancient Nords became something rare, a people no longer defined by their origin story. Atmara receded into myth. Ysgramor became a name rather than a presence. The dragon war lived in songs shortened for long nights. None of this felt like loss. It felt like completion. Completion does not mean disappearance. It means release. The tombs remained, but fewer were built. The old ones were enough. The land did not require constant reinforcement. Memory had settled into the soil itself. Even when individuals forgot, the pattern held. This is why Skyrim never resets. A city may burn, a ruler may fall.
A war may scar the land, but the underlying rhythm resumes. The ancient Nords trusted this rhythm enough to stop intervening unnecessarily. They allowed the world to test itself, to bruise, to recover, to adjust. They had learned that intervention carries its own risks. Restraint, once internalized, becomes invisible, and invisibility is the final stage of influence. When you walk Skyrim and feel that something ancient is present but not demanding attention, that is not emptiness, it is success. It is a culture that no longer needs to announce itself to be real. The ancient Nords are not watching to be remembered. They are watching to ensure that nothing essential is forgotten. And as long as the land still answers careful footsteps differently than careless ones, their work continues. The long evening of the North. In the end, what the ancient Nords left behind was not a lesson meant to be taught, it was a state meant to be entered. Skyrim, as it exists now, feels like a long evening that never fully turns to night. Light lingers low on the horizon, shadows stretch but do not rush. Time seems to slow, not because it truly does, but because urgency has lost its authority here. This is deliberate. The ancient Nords believed that haste was the enemy of understanding. Anything important enough to matter would reveal itself eventually. Anything that demanded immediate action without reflection was usually a trap, set by pride, fear, or impatience. So they shaped a world that resists speed. Roads wind instead of cutting straight. Weather interrupts plans. Distance refuses to shrink. Even speech slows here. Words feel heavier in the cold air, as if they must justify their presence before being spoken. This is not inconvenience, it is filtering. Only intentions willing to endure friction survive long enough to matter. This is why Skyrim feels different to those who stay. At first, the land feels harsh, then confusing. Eventually, if one remains, it becomes clarifying. Desires simplify. Excess sheds itself naturally. What remains is what can be carried without strain. The ancient Nords understood this process intimately. They called it no special name. It was simply living long enough in one place to be changed by it. This philosophy shaped how they viewed age. Elders were not revered for wisdom alone, but for having remained. To stay through countless winters was proof of alignment. Advice from someone who had not endured the land carried less weight, no matter how clever it sounded. Experience mattered only if it was earned locally. This is also why Skyrim rarely produces great innovators, but often produces great keepers. People who maintain rather than transform, who repair rather than redesign, who sense when something should be left as it is. The ancient Nords believed that not every improvement is improvement everywhere. This belief softened their ambition, but sharpened their discernment. As the world beyond Skyrim accelerated, empires expanding, knowledge cataloged, magic systematized, the North slowed further. This was not stagnation, it was counterbalance, a place where speed goes to be tested, stripped, and either discarded or refined. Many who arrived with grand plans left frustrated. Others left quieter, changed in ways they struggled to explain. A few stayed, and in staying stopped needing explanations altogether. This is Skyrim's quiet work. It does not convince, it does not argue, it waits. The ancient Nords trusted waiting more than winning. Victory fades quickly. Waiting reshapes those who endure it. Over time, this reshaping became their final defense. No conqueror could hold Skyrim without becoming something else in the process, and those unwilling to change eventually left. Thus, the ancient Nords achieved something rare: permanence without rigidity. Their culture became less a structure and more a climate. You do not see it directly, you feel it in your bones, especially when you try to move against it. The long evening continues because it is useful. It gives space for thought. It allows grief to settle naturally. It turns noise into distance. And in that distance, meaning reasserts itself. The ancient Nords did not intend to guide the future. They intended to prepare a place where the future would be forced to slow down enough to choose wisely. Skyrim remains that place, not a sanctuary, not a prison, a threshold, one that never closes but never rushes you through. When memory steps aside and the land speaks alone. There is a final stage in every long endurance, not collapse, not forgetting, but withdrawal. The ancient Nords reached this stage without naming it. They did not gather to decide it, nor did any god declare it necessary. It happened the way frost forms, slowly, evenly, without intention, yet with certainty. Memory, once guarded so fiercely, loosened its grip, not because it failed, but because it had done its work. For generations, memory had been law, teacher, and warning. It had shaped behavior when gods were distant and systems fragile. But memory, when held too tightly for too long, can begin to dictate rather than guide. The ancient Nords understood this danger instinctively. They had seen it before, in the dragon cult, in rigid oaths, in power that refused to fade. So they allowed memory to recede. Stories were still told, but with fewer corrections. Names were still spoken, but without insistence on exactness. Contradictions were allowed to coexist. A tale could change slightly and still be true. Meaning mattered more than precision. This was not decay, it was trust. The Nords had learned that a culture which survives only through constant enforcement is already dying. True endurance appears when rules can soften without losing shape. This is why so many Nordic stories feel incomplete. Heroes vanish without clear endings. Battles end without tidy resolution. Even the Dragon War, so central to Skyrim's identity, is remembered unevenly, its edges blurred, its causes debated. This uncertainty is not ignorance, it is permission. Permission for the world to move forward without dragging the past like a weight. At this point, the land assumes the role memory once held. Skyrim begins to teach directly, not through words, but through consequence, not through instruction, but through response. A careless act meets resistance, a thoughtful one meets quiet allowance. This system does not require explanation. It operates continuously, impartially. This is the most advanced form of order the ancient Nords ever achieved. No rulers, no priests, no interpreters, only feedback. The wind answers how it will. The snow closes paths without apology. The mountains remain unmoved. Those who adapt remain. Those who do not leave or change. And because the system does not announce itself, it cannot be easily exploited. There is no rule to bend, no authority to petition, no loophole to discover.
One must simply live within the pattern or be shaped by it. This is why Skyrim resists being fully understood from the outside. Maps fail to convey difficulty, records fail to explain persistence, analysis fails to capture atmosphere. The ancient Nords understood that the most important aspects of a place cannot be taught secondhand. They must be experienced. As memory loosens, reverence changes tone. The gods are still honored, but less often named. They become forces rather than figures. Shor exists as courage rather than character. Kine exists as weather rather than voice. Worship becomes alignment, not appeal. This shift reveals the final spiritual system of the ancient Nords, immanence. The sacred is no longer elsewhere. It is here, embedded, unavoidable. You do not seek it, you respond to it. This is why Skyrim never feels profane, even when cruel.
Harshness is not absence of the sacred. It is one of its expressions. Survival itself becomes a form of reverence. Endurance becomes prayer enacted through time rather than speech. And so the ancient Nords step fully into the background. They no longer require remembrance to exist. Their influence persists without their names. The land carries what needs carrying. The rest dissolves naturally. This is not loss. It is completion so thorough that it no longer needs acknowledgement. When a culture reaches this point, it does not ask to be honored. It asks only to be left intact. Skyrim still stands because it was built to outlast explanation, and those who walk it carefully feel something they cannot quite describe. Not presence, not absence, but a steadiness that does not depend on attention. That steadiness is the final voice of the ancient Nords. It does not speak, it allows. The world after explanation. After memory steps aside, something unusual happens. The world becomes harder to talk about, yet easier to live in. This is the state Skyrim enters when the ancient Nords are fully woven into the land rather than standing behind it. Explanations lose their edge, reasons soften. Cause and effect still exist, but they no longer demand narration. Things happen, and those who live here learn to respond without needing to understand everything first. This is not ignorance, it is functional wisdom. The ancient Nords had long understood that explanation is a tool, not a foundation. It helps build understanding, but if leaned on too heavily, it replaces awareness. A person who needs to know why before acting often acts too late. So, Skyrim teaches differently. It teaches through repetition without commentary. A hunter learns where not to step after the same mistake twice. A traveler learns when to stop pushing forward after one night spent exposed to the wind. A settlement learns where not to build after watching a structure fail slowly, predictably, without drama. No one announces the lesson, no voice explains it. The land simply remembers. This is why Skyrim feels older than its ruins. Age here is not measured by years or by stone, but by how little needs to be said. The most ancient places are often the quietest. A pass used correctly for centuries leaves little trace. A site misunderstood is marked by wreckage, bones, and abandoned effort. The ancient Nords designed their world to reward this silence. Their technology reflected it. Tools were simple, repairable, and adaptable. A Nordic blade was not meant to impress. It was meant to be sharpened repeatedly, reforged if necessary, and passed on. A thing that demanded constant replacement was considered unreliable, no matter how impressive it appeared at first. This practical restraint extended to architecture. Buildings were not designed to resist the land, but to lean into it. Roofs sloped not for beauty, but to accept snow. Foundations were placed where rock already supported weight. When a structure failed, it was studied quietly, then adjusted next time. Progress occurred through correction, not innovation for its own sake. This is a system of survival that does not produce marvels, but produces continuity. Magic in this phase becomes almost invisible. It does not vanish, it simply integrates. Enchantments are small, purposeful, and rarely discussed. Protective runes fade into stonework. Weather sense becomes instinct. What outsiders call superstition is often unspoken pattern recognition refined over generations. The ancient Nords had always feared magic that separated itself from daily life. Here, that fear resolves. Magic that remains useful is allowed to stay. Magic that demands attention dissolves or is quietly removed from relevance. Even the voice follows this pattern. The Thu'um no longer belongs to heroes or legends. It becomes a background force, present in the way sound carries across valleys, in the way silence deepens before storms, in the way certain places seem to amplify intention itself. Words matter more because fewer are spoken. This is not the voice as weapon, it is the voice as resonance. And resonance does not require instruction, it requires presence. By this stage, the ancient Nords are no longer a people that can be pointed to. They exist as habits embedded in behavior, as instincts shared by those who stay long enough, as decisions made without reference to tradition, yet perfectly aligned with it. This is the quiet paradox of their legacy. They succeeded so completely that their success no longer announces itself. Skyrim does not feel governed, it feels weighted.
Weighted with consequence, weighted with history that no longer demands recall, weighted enough to slow reckless motion, but not enough to prevent movement altogether. This balance is delicate but resilient, and it continues because it does not depend on belief, it depends on participation. Anyone can enter Skyrim. Not everyone will remain unchanged. Not everyone will remain at all. The ancient Nords accepted this without regret. A world that allows everything belongs to nothing. A world that shapes those who stay belongs to itself. The permission to stop teaching. There is a point, subtle and almost invisible, where guidance becomes interference. The ancient Nords crossed that point without ceremony. For generations they had taught through story, through warning, through the careful placement of hardship and restraint. But they understood something few cultures ever accept. Teaching has an expiration. When lessons persist longer than necessity, they harden into control. What once protected begins to confine. So the final work of the ancient Nords was not instruction, it was withdrawal from instruction. They stopped correcting every mistake. They stopped preserving every story precisely. They stopped insisting that the past be approached in a particular way. This was not surrender, it was confidence. They trusted that what truly mattered had already embedded itself deeply enough to survive distortion. A story that collapses when retold imperfectly was never strong. A value that vanishes without enforcement was never internalized. The Nords had tested their world long enough to know which parts would hold. This is why Skyrim allows misunderstanding. Ruins are misnamed, legends are confused, histories contradict themselves openly, and the land does not intervene, because intervention is no longer required. Those who misunderstand Skyrim are not punished immediately. They are allowed to proceed, to build, to act. The correction comes later, naturally, when misalignment accumulates enough resistance to be felt. The response is delayed, proportional, and impersonal.
This delay is essential. Immediate consequence teaches fear. Delayed consequence teaches pattern recognition. The ancient Nords wanted the latter. They understood that fear produces compliance, but recognition produces wisdom. A person who understands why something failed does not need to be warned again. A person who is merely frightened will repeat the mistake once the fear fades. So Skyrim became patient. It allows errors to unfold fully before responding. A settlement placed poorly may last years before failing. A custom introduced carelessly may persist generations before collapsing. This long arc ensures that those who live through the outcome learn deeply or leave. This is the land's final pedagogy, and it is why Skyrim feels honest. Nothing is hidden to protect feelings. Nothing is rushed to prevent discomfort. The world assumes that those who remain are capable of learning. The ancient Nords believed this was the highest form of respect, to assume competence, to allow failure without humiliation, to provide feedback without explanation. By stepping back, they ensured that the land itself would finish the work. This is also why nostalgia holds little power here. Longing for a purer past is discouraged by the sheer difficulty of survival. Romanticizing history becomes tiring when winter arrives, regardless of belief. The present always demands attention. Thus, Skyrim remains grounded. Even reverence is practical. You respect the land not because ancestors did, but because ignoring it produces immediate inconvenience and eventual harm. Tradition survives because it works, not because it is old. This is the ancient Nords' final safeguard against stagnation. Tradition without function dissolves. Function without tradition adapts. What remains is usable truth. By releasing the need to be understood, the ancient Nords ensured they would never be misunderstood in any way that mattered. Their presence is no longer an instruction, but in a permission. Permission for the world to respond honestly. Permission for people to learn at their own pace. Permission for meaning to emerge without narration. Skyrim does not explain itself because it does not need to, and neither do the ancient Nords. When the story learns to thin. At some point, even a careful voice must learn to grow lighter, not silent, just less insistent. This is the stage where the ancient Nords finally let the story thin, the way smoke thins after a long fire, still present in the air, but no longer demanding attention. What remains is not absence, but space. Space for listening, space for noticing, space for living without commentary. Skyrim enters this stage naturally. No marker separates it from what came before. One simply realizes over time that fewer explanations are needed, that questions begin to answer themselves through experience, that understanding arrives not as revelation, but as recognition. The ancient Nords believed recognition was the most trustworthy form of knowledge. You do not argue with it.
You do not defend it. You simply adjust. This is why in Skyrim, wisdom often appears unremarkable. It speaks plainly, if at all. It does not gather followers. It does not demand preservation. It exists in small decisions made consistently over time: where to stop, when to wait, what to leave untouched. This quiet clarity reshapes even conflict. Disputes still arise, but they lose their theatrical edge. They are resolved by proximity, by consequence, by who remains present long enough to feel the outcome. Loud certainty fades faster than patient alignment. Those who shout eventually exhaust themselves. Those who listen remain. The ancient Nords trusted this attrition. They understood that extremes burn quickly in cold climates. Only balance sustains heat. As the story thins, the need for identity also loosens. People stop asking what it means to be Nordic.
The question itself becomes unnecessary. Identity becomes situational. How one behaves in winter, how one treats the dead, how one responds to scarcity. These are not symbols, they are reflexes, and reflexes do not require memory, they require repetition. This is why even newcomers, after enough time, begin to move differently. Their pace changes, their expectations soften. They learn to accept incomplete information, to trust weather over plan, to value preparation over optimism. Skyrim teaches this without pride. There is no sense of superiority in the land, only indifference to those who refuse to adapt. Not punishment, non-accommodation. The world does not bend to meet insistence. It remains as it is, allowing insistence to tire itself out. This is the final refinement of Nordic endurance. Not hardness, not defiance, but non-negotiation with reality. The ancient Nords believed reality was not cruel, it was consistent. Cruelty arose when expectation collided with consistency. Peace emerged when expectation adjusted. Thus, the story no longer needs to explain dragons, gods, or wars. Those were mechanisms for learning alignment. Once alignment becomes habitual, mechanisms recede. This is why, at this stage, the past feels less dramatic. It is not diminished, it is absorbed. Absorbed into posture, into choice, into silence. And silence, when earned, is not emptiness, it is density without noise. Skyrim reaches this density. The world feels full even when nothing happens. A day without event does not feel wasted, it feels complete. The ancient Nords understood this as a sign of success, when time itself feels inhabited. At this point, the story could continue forever.
And that is precisely why it should not. Because a story that insists on continuing after its work is done becomes obstruction. It prevents the listener from hearing what comes next on their own. The ancient Nords stepped back here. So will this telling. The last shape of endurance. What endures longest is rarely what announces itself. The ancient Nords understood this with a certainty that came only after everything loud had failed them. Gods that shouted, dragons that commanded, empires that catalogued. Each had left marks on Skyrim, but none had shaped it as deeply as what followed afterward. What followed was ordinary persistence. Not heroism, not conquest, not belief. Just people waking, working, enduring, and sleeping again beneath the same sky. This is the last shape the ancient Nords took. They ceased to exist as a subject of history and became a baseline, a measure against which all other ways of living in Skyrim would be tested, often without realizing it. New rulers arrived with systems and promises. New conflicts rose with urgency and noise, but over time, each was pressed gently but firmly against the same quiet standard. Does it hold through winter? Does it respect the dead? Does it listen before acting? If the answer was no, it thinned out naturally. This is why Skyrim never collapses all at once. It sheds, it erodes selectively. What cannot adapt simply does not last long enough to define the whole. The ancient Nords did not prevent change, they ensured change could not move faster than understanding. This endurance shaped even how time is felt. In Skyrim, time does not rush forward, it layers. Events stack rather than replace. A ruin does not erase what stands above it. A new custom does not fully overwrite the old. Instead, everything becomes partially true at once, depending on where you stand and how deeply you look. This layered time is one of the ancient Nords' quietest systems. It prevents absolutism. If no single era fully replaces another, no single truth can claim permanence. Certainty is always provisional.
This keeps arrogance in check far more effectively than law or fear ever could. The ancient Nords trusted this slow friction. They trusted that a world heavy with accumulated context would resist simple answers, that those who sought domination would grow frustrated, that those who sought belonging would learn patience. And patience, over time, reshapes desire. What begins as ambition softens into stewardship. What begins as curiosity matures into care. What begins as survival deepens into responsibility. This is how a people fade without vanishing. Their names recede. Their faces disappear from memory, but their expectations remain embedded, even now. Skyrim reacts differently to different kinds of presence. It opens slightly to those who arrive prepared to change. It closes subtly to those who arrive intent on changing everything else. This is not judgment, it is calibration. The ancient Nords calibrated the land by living within it long enough to be shaped, then stepping aside so that shaping could continue without them. This was their final gift, a world that does not need its creators to function. And so, even this telling grows thinner, not because there is nothing left to say, but because saying more would intrude on the very quality being described. The ancient Nords believed that meaning reveals itself most clearly when space is left around it. Silence to them was not emptiness, it was room. Room for breath, room for adjustment, room for the world to speak back. Skyrim still has that room, and those who enter it, whether they know the old stories or not, are quietly invited to decide how they will move within it. No voice tells them what to choose. The land simply waits. The wait that teaches without words. There is a particular heaviness that belongs only to places that have endured long enough to stop proving themselves. Skyrim carries this weight. It is not the weight of tragedy nor of glory. It is the weight of accumulated consequence, choices made, corrected, and then allowed to fade into habit. To stand in such a place is to feel that actions matter even when no one is watching, that decisions echo even when they seem small. The ancient Nords trusted this weight more than any decree. They believed that when consequence is consistent, instruction becomes unnecessary. The world itself becomes the teacher, and the lesson adjusts to the learner. Those who push learn resistance. Those who pause learn timing. Those who listen learn roots invisible to hurried eyes. This is how Skyrim continues to shape people without asserting itself. Consider the roads again, not as paths, but as agreements. A road that survives centuries does so because it aligns with terrain, weather, and need. When a road fails, it is not blamed, it is abandoned. Another emerges nearby, quieter, more efficient, discovered rather than designed. The ancient Nords understood infrastructure as dialogue, not imposition.
The same is true of settlement. Towns that endure do not dominate their surroundings. They occupy edges, valleys, places where wind breaks and water behaves. Expansion happens cautiously. Retreat is accepted when required. This is not defeat, it is recalibration. This reveals a subtle political system still at work. Authority yields to environment. Leaders who listen remain effective longer than those who insist. A jarl who ignores winter loses trust faster than one who adapts to it. Power here is provisional, renewed each season through competence rather than proclamation.
This expectation traces directly back to ancient Nordic belief. The gods, after all, had stepped back, dragons had been answered, empires had been absorbed and slowed. If nothing above was absolute, then nothing below could afford to be. This understanding reshaped social bonds. Hospitality existed, but it was measured. Help was offered, but it was practical. Excess generosity was viewed with suspicion, not because kindness was distrusted, but because imbalance invited dependency. The ancient Nords believed that helping someone in a way that weakened them was a subtle form of harm. So assistance came with expectation, not repayment, but adaptation. Learn how to endure, then remain. This ethic persists in the quiet ways people assess one another, not by speech, but by response to difficulty. Who keeps working when plans fail? Who adjusts without complaint? Who notices when to stop? Skyrim notices these things. The ancient Nords designed no test for belonging because they believed the land would conduct it continuously. There was no single moment of acceptance, only a gradual reduction of resistance. One day the storms feel predictable, the paths feel familiar, the silence feels comfortable rather than oppressive. That is when one belongs, not announced, not celebrated, simply noticed by absence of friction. And this is why leaving Skyrim often feels strange. Those who depart after long residence carry something with them, not nostalgia, but calibration. Other places feel louder, quicker to explain themselves, too eager to reassure or persuade. The world elsewhere seems to argue more than it needs to. This contrast reveals the ancient Nords' deepest influence. They built a place where reality does not negotiate, not out of cruelty, but clarity. In such a place, pretense thins quickly. What remains is what can be lived with day after day, season after season. Over time, this pressure refines people. Some grow sharper, others softer. Many leave. A few stay and stop noticing the weight entirely. Those are the ones the land keeps. The ancient Nords expected this outcome. They did not mourn those who left. They did not chase those who stayed. They allowed sorting to happen without judgment. This neutrality is not indifference, it is confidence. Confidence that the world, left intact, will shape what needs shaping. As this telling continues, it grows lighter, not because meaning fades, but because meaning has settled where it belongs, outside explanation, inside experience. When endurance becomes ordinary. There is a point at which endurance stops feeling like effort. It does not disappear, it becomes background. This is the stage Skyrim has lived in for longer than most remember. Survival no longer feels heroic here. It feels expected. Not because life is easy, but because difficulty has been accounted for. Plans include failure by default. Schedules bend around weather without resentment. Loss is anticipated, not welcomed, but prepared for. The ancient Nords understood that when endurance becomes ordinary, it stops needing praise. Praise tempts excess. Excess invites collapse. So they allowed endurance to fade into routine. This is why Skyrim produces few grand philosophies. Its wisdom is not abstract, it is situational, responsive, and unremarkable. A person who knows when to stop walking before dark knows more than one who can explain why darkness is dangerous. Explanation lags behind practice here. The land reinforces this constantly. Paths that are walked respectfully remain clear. Paths rushed erode. Camps built with attention last. Camps built in haste fail. These outcomes do not feel moral, they feel mechanical. And that is precisely the point. The ancient Nords removed morality from survival. They did not frame endurance as virtue or failure as sin. They framed both as information. The world responds, you adjust. Nothing more is required. This neutrality calms the spirit. It reduces the need for justification. One does not need to feel righteous to endure winter. One needs to prepare. Emotion becomes secondary to alignment. This does not make life colder, it makes it steadier. Over time, steadiness reshapes expectation. People stop asking whether things will work out. They ask what can be done if they do not. Hope becomes quieter, more durable. It no longer depends on outcomes, but on capacity to respond. This is Skyrim's final refinement of resilience. Not optimism, not despair, but prepared acceptance. The ancient Nords believed this was the most humane state a culture could reach. When people are not constantly bracing for surprise, they have room for small joys, a clear morning, a shared meal, a story told simply without needing to impress. Joy here is understated but persistent. It does not require contrast to feel meaningful. It exists alongside hardship without being diminished by it. This balance is rare and it is fragile. It requires a world that does not constantly escalate stakes. Skyrim resists escalation naturally. When something grows too large, too loud, too demanding, it is slowed by terrain, weather, distance, or indifference. The ancient Nords trusted these forces more than any council or creed. They believed that the world, left intact, would prevent extremes better than rules ever could. So they stopped correcting constantly. They let things fail at manageable scales. They let people learn through consequence. They let time do most of the work. This patience is what outsiders often mistake for stagnation, but stagnation decays. Skyrim settles. Settling is different. It allows motion but dampens shock. It absorbs change without shattering. It keeps things close to workable proportions. This is why endurance here feels unremarkable, and why that unremarkableness is so powerful. The ancient Nords did not aim to be remembered for greatness. They aimed to build a place where greatness was unnecessary, where life could continue competently without constant intervention. They succeeded. And so the world continues, day after day, shaped by forces that no longer need to announce themselves. The peace that does not call itself peace. What the ancient Nords arrived at, after everything else had fallen away, was something they never named. They did not call it peace. Peace to them implied resolution, an ending, a release from tension. And Skyrim was never without tension. Snow still buried paths, storms still claimed the careless, loss still arrived without warning. The world did not soften. Instead, the ancient Nords reached a state where tension no longer felt hostile. It became familiar. This familiarity changed how people moved through their lives. Hardship stopped feeling personal. When a roof collapsed under snow, it was not interpreted as misfortune or punishment. It was information. Something had been misjudged. Something would be adjusted next time. This emotional neutrality was not coldness, it was trust. Trust that the world was not conspiring against them. Trust that effort mattered.
Trust that outcomes, even painful ones, fit within a pattern that could be lived with. The ancient Nords believed this trust was the closest mortals could come to harmony with existence. Not happiness, not safety, but reliability. A reliable world does not promise comfort, it promises consistency. And consistency allows planning, patience, and quiet confidence to take root. Over time, this confidence replaces anxiety. People stop scanning constantly for threats. They conserve energy for what actually requires attention. This conservation of attention is subtle but powerful. It creates mental stillness. In Skyrim, this stillness is felt most strongly during moments that would feel empty elsewhere. A long walk with no conversation, a watch through the night with nothing happening, a season where nothing changes except light and temperature. These moments are not filled, they are allowed. The ancient Nords understood that a life without space collapses inward. Noise crowds out perception. Constant stimulation dulls response. By allowing long stretches of uneventfulness, they preserved sensitivity. When something finally did change, it was noticed immediately. This attentiveness is why Skyrim often feels alert even in silence. The land is not waiting for something to happen, it is prepared for when it does. This readiness permeates everything. Tools are kept within reach, supplies are checked without urgency, stories are told without embellishment. People speak plainly, not because they lack imagination, but because clarity travels farther in cold air. Over generations, this plainness becomes kindness. Not expressive kindness, practical kindness. Help arrives without ceremony. Advice is given without condescension. Praise is sparse but sincere. Excess emotion is not discouraged, it simply has nowhere to anchor. The world does not react dramatically, so drama loses momentum. The ancient Nords considered this a mercy. They had seen what worlds ruled by spectacle became. They had lived under gods who demanded attention and dragons who required submission. They knew how exhausting it was to exist in a state of constant significance. So they built a place where nothing needs to feel important all the time. This is the peace they achieved. A peace that does not stop conflict. A peace that does not eliminate loss. A peace that removes the pressure to interpret every moment as meaningful. Meaning emerges on its own when needed, and because it is not forced, it lasts. This is why the ancient Nords did not fear fading from memory. A world like this does not require ancestors watching over it. It requires systems that function without supervision. It requires people capable of meeting reality without narration. Skyrim became that world, quietly, gradually, without claiming success. And that, to the ancient Nords, was the clearest sign that their work was done. The still point where effort softens. There is a moment, almost imperceptible, when even endurance relaxes its grip. Not because the world has become easy, but because effort no longer feels like resistance. It feels like motion within permission. This is the still point the ancient Nords gradually approached. Not an end, but a balance so stable that it stops calling attention to itself. In this state, people no longer measure themselves against hardship, they simply meet it. The question shifts from, "Can I endure this?" to, "What does this require?" Strength becomes situational rather than performative. Pride dissolves into usefulness. The ancient Nords believed this was maturity, not of individuals, but of a culture. A mature culture does not need to test itself constantly. It trusts its reflexes. It knows when to push and when to yield. It does not mistake movement for progress or stillness for failure. Skyrim settles into this maturity. Work is done steadily, without urgency. Repairs are made before collapse becomes spectacle. Preparations happen early, quietly, with no expectation of praise. People stop talking about readiness because readiness is assumed. This assumption changes emotional tone.
Anxiety thins, not because danger vanishes, but because it is anticipated without dread. Fear loses its narrative power. It becomes one signal among many, not the dominant one. The ancient Nords understood fear as information, not command. When fear arises, it is noted, weighed, and addressed proportionately. Panic is discouraged not through suppression, but through familiarity. A known winter is less frightening than an imagined one. A known risk is easier to prepare for than an undefined threat. Thus, uncertainty shrinks, not eliminated, but framed.
This framing extends even to death. Loss remains painful, but it no longer destabilizes the living. Grief has a place, and that place is not rushed. Mourners are given space, not instruction. Time does the work it always has. The ancient Nords trusted time more than counsel. This trust produces an unusual calm. Not the calm of indifference, but the calm of adequate pacing. Nothing needs to be hurried into meaning. Nothing needs to be resolved immediately. In Skyrim, a problem can remain a problem for years without poisoning everything around it. People learn to live adjacent to difficulty without allowing it to dominate their identity. This is not avoidance, it is containment. Containment preserves capacity. The ancient Nords had learned, through long centuries, that the greatest danger was not hardship itself, but exhaustion from constant reaction. By slowing response to match necessity rather than emotion, they preserved energy across generations. This is why Skyrim feels patient, even in crisis. Movements are deliberate, decisions are measured, excess force is rare. When action comes, it is usually late, but precise. Late action is not weakness here, it is confidence. Confidence that not every tension requires resolution. Some resolve themselves when left alone, others clarify over time. Acting too early often creates larger problems than waiting. This philosophy does not produce heroes often, it produces survivors consistently. And survivors, over time, build worlds that do not require saving. This is the still point the ancient Nords reached, a place where effort softens into routine, where vigilance relaxes into awareness, where strength becomes quiet enough to feel like rest. Not rest from labor, rest from urgency. Skyrim lives here now, and those who live long enough within it feel their own urgency thin. They stop chasing certainty. They stop demanding clarity. They begin to trust adjustment more than answers. The story, too, approaches this stillness, not because it has nowhere else to go, but because motion without need would disturb what has settled. When the world finally exhales, there is a sound that exists only in places that have carried weight for a very long time. It is not silence, it is the moment just after effort releases, when nothing collapses because everything has already been aligned. The ancient Nords understood this sound without naming it. They built toward it unknowingly, then recognized it only after it arrived. Skyrim learned how to exhale. The exhale is subtle. It does not announce relief. It does not change the world dramatically. It simply allows the constant tightening against cold, against loss, against uncertainty to loosen slightly.
Not enough to invite carelessness, just enough to let the body rest without falling. This is the state Skyrim holds now. You can sense it in the way days pass without urgency, in the way people pause before responding, not because they hesitate, but because there is no need to rush, in the way storms arrive without panic and leave without celebration. The ancient Nords believed this exhale was sacred, not because it came from the gods, but because it meant the world no longer needed to shout to be heard.
When a land exhales, it signals that its systems are working, that correction happens gently, that endurance no longer consumes itself. This exhale reshapes perception. Time stretches, not endlessly, but generously. Moments gain room to unfold without being framed as important or insignificant. A walk can simply be a walk. A night can simply be cold. A conversation can end without resolution and still feel complete. This completeness without closure is rare. Most worlds demand endings. They insist on conclusions, lessons, summaries. Skyrim does not. It allows things to remain open, trusting that what needs to close will do so naturally. The ancient Nords built this trust slowly, painfully, through trial and error across centuries. Once achieved, they did not celebrate it. Celebration tightens attention again. It invites pride. Pride invites imbalance. So they allowed the exhale to remain unmarked. No monument commemorates it. No story names it clearly. No ritual enforces it. It exists only as atmosphere. And atmosphere, once established, outlasts narrative. This is why the ancient Nords fade completely here, not into absence, but into background stability. Their presence becomes indistinguishable from the land's own behavior. No one asks whether a practice is Nordic anymore. They ask whether it works. If it works, it stays. If it does not, it goes. This simplicity is not naivety, it is refinement. A refined system does not require justification. It proves itself through consistency. The ancient Nords trusted consistency more than ideals. Ideals change, consistency accumulates. And so the world breathes. Snow falls without symbolism. Fire burns without ceremony. People endure without needing to call it strength. Even struggle loses its dramatic edge. It becomes something you move through rather than something that defines you. Identity detaches from hardship. Survival ceases to be a story and becomes a condition. This detachment is not loss of meaning, it is freedom from over-meaning. The ancient Nords had learned that when everything is meaningful, nothing can rest. Rest, however, is not absence of purpose, it is purpose allowed to settle.
Skyrim settles, and in settling it continues, not louder, not grander, but steadier. The story now rests at the edge of speech, not finished, not ongoing, simply present like the land itself, requiring nothing, offering everything to those willing to remain long enough to notice. After the breath, the steady quiet. After the world exhales, nothing dramatic follows. This is perhaps the most difficult thing to accept. No new age announces itself. No clarity arrives like a reward. The ancient Nords understood that a true exhale does not lead to revelation. It leads to continuation without strain. Life resumes not because it must, but because it no longer needs to prove that it can. Skyrim moves in this way now. Days follow days without asking to be interpreted. Work is done because it is there to be done. Rest happens because bodies recognize when it is required. The land no longer feels like something to survive against. It feels like something to move within. This shift is subtle but decisive. Earlier ages demanded attention. Dragons demanded obedience. Gods demanded belief. Empires demanded loyalty. Even memory demanded preservation. Each of these pulled the world tight, forcing response. Now nothing demands. And because nothing demands, people begin to notice what invites. A sheltered valley invites settlement. A clear stretch of weather invites travel. A quiet evening invites story or silence. Invitation replaces compulsion.
The ancient Nords believed this was the healthiest relationship a people could have with their world. When survival no longer dominates perception, curiosity can return. Not the reckless curiosity of conquest, but the gentle curiosity of coexistence. This is when creativity appears again. Not innovation driven by urgency, but small refinements. A better way to stack firewood, a sturdier hinge, a story told with a slightly different emphasis. None of these change the world quickly. All of them change it durably. Durability mattered more than brilliance to the ancient Nords. A brilliant solution that fails in winter is worse than a plain one that endures. So Skyrim fills with quiet improvements no one claims credit for. Progress without authorship. Change without ego. This anonymity is intentional. When no one owns the improvement, no one defends it out of pride. It remains only as long as it works.
This allows constant adjustment without conflict. The world becomes flexible without becoming unstable. This is why Skyrim feels adaptable without feeling chaotic. Even belief adapts in this phase. Faith becomes less about articulation and more about posture. A person shows reverence not through words, but through how they move through the world. Whether they take more than they need, whether they leave places usable for those who come after, whether they recognize when to stop. The gods in this posture-based faith do not need names. They exist as expectations embedded in consequence. Alignment replaces devotion. Awareness replaces doctrine. The ancient Nords trusted this form of belief the most because it could not be faked convincingly for long. Anyone can say the right words, few can move correctly over time. Skyrim rewards the latter. And so the ancient Nords complete their last transformation. They are no longer ancestors to be remembered. They are no longer teachers to be consulted. They are no longer even witnesses. They are conditions. Conditions that shape behavior gently. Conditions that make certain actions easier and others more difficult. Conditions that do not argue, persuade, or explain. This is the deepest influence any culture can achieve, to become inseparable from the environment itself. At this stage, the story becomes almost unnecessary. Words begin to feel like excess, not wrong, just more than required. Meaning has moved fully into experience. And yet, for a little while longer, the voice remains, not to teach, not to conclude, but to accompany. So we remain here, in the steady quiet after the breath, where nothing is ending and nothing is beginning, only continuing in a way that no longer needs to be noticed. Staying without holding. There is a final refinement beyond quiet. It is the ability to remain without grasping. The ancient Nords reached this state not through intention, but through relief. Once the world no longer needed constant attention, they discovered that presence itself could soften. You could stay without guarding. You could watch without measuring. You could care without tightening around what you cared for. Skyrim learned how to stay this way. The land does not cling to those who walk it well. It does not try to keep them. It allows movement without resentment. Those who leave are not chased by longing. Those who stay are not bound by obligation. Belonging becomes non-exclusive and thus more durable. This is a rare condition. Most places hold tightly. They demand loyalty, identity, affirmation. Skyrim does not. It remains available, but not accommodating beyond its nature. If you can move with it, you are welcome. If you cannot, it does not argue. The ancient Nords believed this was the most respectful stance a world could take toward its people. Respect does not persuade, it does not flatter, it does not trap, it simply exists honestly. This honesty allows grief to pass through without becoming attachment.
Loss is felt fully, then released. Memory is allowed to fade where it no longer serves, without guilt. Nothing essential is lost, because essentials have already embedded themselves deeper than recollection. This is why nostalgia rarely takes root here. The past is not framed as better, it is framed as finished. Useful in its time, then allowed to step aside. Even the ancient Nords did not imagine their way of living as something to be preserved indefinitely. They saw it as scaffolding, necessary until the structure could stand on its own. When the structure stands, scaffolding is removed. And so it was. Skyrim stands now without visible support. It holds weight quietly. It absorbs impact without protest. It yields when it must and resists when it should. There is no central intention driving it, only accumulated alignment. This alignment makes effort feel lighter. People still work hard, but they do not feel worked upon. Tasks are chosen for fit rather than ambition. Success is measured by sustainability, not expansion. Growth happens inward, through competence, not accumulation. The ancient Nords trusted inward growth because it cannot be taken away easily. Land can be seized, titles can be revoked, structures can burn, but competence persists, awareness transfers, posture endures. This is why Skyrim outlasts its eras, not because it defeats them, but because it does not depend on them. As the telling continues, it grows more transparent. Words thin not from exhaustion, but from respect. To keep speaking now would be to reintroduce grasping, an attempt to hold what has already settled. So the voice stays light, present but not insistent, attentive but not directive. The ancient Nords would recognize this moment. They would know it as the point where guidance steps back, not because the listener has learned everything, but because learning has become self-sustaining. Skyrim no longer needs to be interpreted to function. It simply needs to be entered carefully. And so we remain, without holding, without closing, without needing to move forward or backward, just here. When even staying becomes effortless. There comes a moment when staying no longer feels like a choice, not because leaving is impossible, but because remaining requires no explanation. The ancient Nords recognized this moment as the truest measure of alignment. When effort dissolves so fully into habit that awareness no longer has to supervise it, a person is no longer enduring a place, they are simply present within it. Skyrim holds people in this way, not tightly. Not sentimentally, but neutrally, like a slope that supports a stance without demanding balance. In this state, attention widens. It is no longer narrowed by vigilance or expectation. One notices small variations without attaching meaning to them. A change in wind direction, the way light touches stone differently in late afternoon. The subtle signals that once required thought now arrive as intuition. The ancient Nords trusted intuition deeply, but only after it had been trained by long exposure. Intuition without experience was dismissed as impulse, but intuition shaped by seasons, repetition, and consequence was considered the highest form of intelligence. This is why elders often spoke less as they aged, not because they knew less, but because knowledge had moved beneath language. Advice became unnecessary. Correction became rare. Presence itself did the teaching. Skyrim still operates this way. Those who remain long enough begin to feel when something is slightly off before they can name it. A sense that a path should not be taken today, that a task should wait, that a conversation has reached its natural end. Acting on these sensations rarely requires justification because the outcomes reinforce them quietly. This feedback loop is the land's final refinement. No instruction, no punishment, only reinforcement through lived result. The ancient Nords understood that this kind of learning cannot be rushed. It cannot be transferred secondhand. It cannot be archived. It requires time spent without agenda. This is why Skyrim resists efficiency. Efficiency removes friction too quickly. It short-circuits perception. A world optimized for speed teaches little about consequence. The ancient Nords avoided this trap by allowing inconvenience to remain. Distance, cold, and unpredictability were not flaws to be eliminated, they were teachers. Even now, attempts to fully tame the land fail subtly. Roads degrade, systems require constant maintenance, plans collapse at their edges, not in rebellion, but in reminder. The reminder is simple: you are participating, not controlling. This understanding frees energy. Once control is relinquished, effort redirects itself toward cooperation. People stop forcing outcomes and start working with conditions. This shift reduces exhaustion more effectively than rest ever could. The ancient Nords believed exhaustion came not from labor, but from resistance to reality. Remove the resistance, and labor becomes sustainable. This is why staying eventually feels effortless here, not because life becomes easy, but because friction aligns with expectation. Nothing surprises in a way that demands outrage. Difficulty arrives with context. Loss arrives with space to process. Success arrives without pressure to expand endlessly. The world stops asking to be conquered. It asks only to be met. At this point, even identity loosens further. One stops thinking in terms of belonging and starts thinking in terms of fit. Not, is this my place, but does this movement fit the moment?
The answer changes, and so does behavior without crisis. This fluidity is the last echo of ancient Nordic wisdom. They did not seek permanence of form, they sought permanence of adaptability, and adaptability, once embedded deeply enough, does not need defense. As this telling continues, it grows lighter still, not toward disappearance, but toward transparency. The words do not vanish, they become less noticeable, like breath in cold air once the body warms. We are close now to the point where continuation and stillness are nearly the same thing. Motion without strain. At this stage, even rest stops feeling separate from movement. The ancient Nords did not think in terms of stopping and starting. They thought in terms of flow that thickens or thins. Work intensified when needed, softened when it could. Stillness appeared naturally inside motion, the way calm exists inside steady breathing. Skyrim lives in this state now. People move, but not urgently. Decisions are made, but rarely defended. Change occurs, but it does not accelerate unless the land itself allows it. Nothing feels stalled, yet nothing feels rushed. This balance is not enforced, it emerges from long familiarity with consequence. The ancient Nords believed that strain was a signal, not a requirement. When effort turned sharp, something was misaligned. Either timing was wrong or scale had exceeded capacity. Rather than pushing harder, they learned to adjust position, step back, step sideways, wait. Waiting was never passive here. It was active patience, attention held without forcing outcome. This kind of patience reshapes how ambition behaves. Ambition does not disappear, but it loses its hunger. Goals are chosen for durability rather than magnitude. A plan that can survive interruption is valued more than one that dazzles briefly. This is why Skyrim rarely produces monuments meant to impress from afar. Its works are meant to function up close, in bad weather, under neglect. Beauty, when it appears, is incidental, a byproduct of fit rather than intent. The ancient Nords trusted this kind of beauty because it could not be faked easily. Fit reveals itself over time. As effort relaxes, judgment softens too.
People stop sorting experiences into success and failure so rigidly. Outcomes are assessed by what they teach, not what they promise. Even mistakes are allowed to age before being evaluated. Immediate reaction is replaced by delayed understanding. This delay deepens insight. The ancient Nords believed that meaning ripens slowly. Harvested too early, it is thin. Given time, it strengthens. So they let events settle before naming them. A war became a lesson generations later. A disaster became guidance only after its echoes faded. This restraint in interpretation prevented overreaction. Skyrim still carries this habit. News travels slowly. Rumors lose force as they move through distance and weather. By the time something reaches the far holds, its sharpest edges have dulled. What remains is what truly matters. This is not inefficiency, it is filtration. Only information that can survive repetition and delay deserves to shape action. Everything else dissolves harmlessly along the way. The ancient Nords trusted this filtration because it aligned with their deepest fear, acting on incomplete understanding. They had seen too much damage done by certainty that arrived too early. So they learned to let clarity arrive late but intact. This is why motion here feels unstrained. Decisions are not constantly revised. Courses are set cautiously, then followed with confidence. When correction comes, it is accepted without shame. Adjustment is not seen as reversal, but as refinement. In this state, even conflict loses its sharpness. Disagreements occur, but they are rarely escalated quickly. People live alongside unresolved differences without forcing resolution. Time is allowed to weigh in. Often one side adjusts naturally. Sometimes both do. Occasionally neither does, and the situation stabilizes anyway. The ancient Nords believed that not every conflict requires victory. Some require endurance until relevance fades. This belief keeps the world from overheating. Skyrim remains cool enough to think. As this telling continues, it now moves almost without effort, like walking a path you know well in low light. You no longer scan every step. Your body remembers where to place itself. The story is no longer leading, it is accompanying. When progress stops needing direction, there comes a time when movement no longer points anywhere in particular, not because there is nowhere to go, but because direction has already been absorbed into the way things are done. The ancient Nords recognized this as a quiet success. When people no longer ask where they are headed, but simply whether the next step fits, the path has done its work. Skyrim lives inside this condition. Travel still happens, change still occurs, but progress is no longer driven by vision alone. It is guided by fit in the moment, a continual adjustment so small it rarely feels like choice. One turn is taken instead of another. One season's plan is shortened. One structure is repaired rather than replaced. These decisions accumulate not into a grand arc, but into coherence. The ancient Nords valued coherence above ambition. Ambition stretches outward, coherence holds inward. A coherent life can accept interruption without losing shape.
A coherent place can absorb newcomers without dissolving. This is why Skyrim never feels lost, even when it feels directionless. Its direction is implicit. Implicit direction does not announce goals, it reveals boundaries. It says, this works here, this does not. Over time, those who remain learn these boundaries not as rules, but as instincts. They stop testing edges unnecessarily, not out of fear,
but because doing so feels inefficient. Efficiency here is not speed, it is appropriateness. The ancient Nords believed that the most wasteful action was the one that required explanation afterward. A good action explained itself by not needing defense. When something fit, it endured quietly. When it did not, it demanded justification and repair. So justification became suspect. This suspicion reshaped speech. Words grew fewer. Promises grew narrower. Claims were made carefully because they would be measured against time rather than applause. A person learned quickly that saying less preserved credibility longer. Skyrim still rewards this restraint. Declarations fade quickly here. Patterns persist. This persistence extends to emotion as well. Feelings are not suppressed, but they are not allowed to drive long-term action without settling first. Anger cools. Excitement matures. Grief moves at its own pace, without being hurried toward meaning. The ancient Nords believed that emotion needed room, not resolution. Given room, it aligns with reality. Forced into clarity too early, it distorts. This belief softened social expectations. People learned not to demand immediate responses. Silence was not interpreted as absence. Delay was not seen as avoidance. Time itself became a collaborator in understanding. This collaboration reduced conflict more effectively than any law. When people are allowed to arrive at their own conclusions slowly, they defend them less aggressively. Certainty softens, flexibility increases. The world grows quieter, not because disagreements vanish, but because they lose urgency. Urgency, the ancient Nords knew, is the enemy of endurance. By removing urgency from most things, they preserved energy for what truly required swift action. When danger did appear, response was immediate, not because people were anxious, but because they were available. Availability is the opposite of readiness strained by constant alertness. Skyrim remains available, not reactive, not dormant, simply ready without tension. This readiness feels almost invisible until it is needed. Then it appears fully formed, without rehearsal. The ancient Nords trusted this state because it could not be fabricated. It emerged only after long exposure to consequence. As this telling continues, it mirrors that readiness. It does not rush toward conclusion. It does not circle anxiously. It remains open, allowing meaning to settle where it naturally does. We are now in the place where progress no longer needs direction, because direction has become habit, and habit, when aligned, carries you farther than intention ever could. Presence without momentum. Eventually, even the sense of moving forward becomes optional, not because the world has stalled, but because presence itself carries enough continuity. The ancient Nords would have recognized this state immediately. It is the moment when momentum no longer needs encouragement and stillness no longer feels like pause. Skyrim enters this condition quietly. People wake, act, and rest without measuring progress against yesterday. Time is felt sideways rather than forward, layered, textured, overlapping. A task completed does not signal advancement, it signals fit. Another task will arise when needed, and it will be met the same way. This sideways time changes how life is experienced. Anticipation softens, regret loosens, attention returns to what is immediately workable. The ancient Nords trusted this orientation because it reduced the psychological weight of continuity. Life did not need to go somewhere, it needed to hold together. Holding together is a different kind of success. A structure that holds together does not impress from afar, but it survives contact. A culture that holds together can be entered at any point without requiring initiation. A person who holds together can endure contradiction without fracturing. Skyrim holds together. This cohesion does not depend on agreement. It depends on tolerance for incompleteness. Questions remain unanswered without generating anxiety. Plans remain provisional without being abandoned. People live alongside uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. The ancient Nords believed that uncertainty, when allowed to persist, becomes informative rather than threatening. It shows where assumptions are weak. It reveals where patience is needed. It prevents premature certainty. This belief shaped their final posture toward the world: non-insistence. They did not insist that life be meaningful in obvious ways. They did not insist that actions be justified immediately. They did not insist that outcomes validate effort. Insistence creates friction. Non-insistence creates space. Space, over time, allows alignment to appear on its own. This is why Skyrim feels accommodating without being permissive. It does not forbid much, it simply refuses to adapt to everything. What fits remains. What does not fit eventually drifts away or reshapes itself. This natural sorting requires no enforcement. The ancient Nords trusted this more than any boundary drawn deliberately.
Boundaries declared invite testing. Boundaries embedded into consequence simply exist. Skyrim's boundaries are embedded. Weather does not negotiate. Distance does not apologize. Time does not hurry. These conditions teach continuously without instruction. They ask no questions. They offer no approval. They simply respond. And because response is consistent, people learn to read it without thinking. This literacy of response is the last inheritance of the ancient Nords. Not knowledge of stories, not mastery of tools, but the ability to sense when something aligns. Alignment feels like ease without comfort. Disalignment feels like strain without drama. Between the two, choice becomes simpler. As the telling continues, it now rests almost entirely on this sensation. Words point toward it, but cannot contain it. To continue speaking risks reintroducing momentum where none is needed, so the voice becomes lighter still, present but almost transparent, guiding but not directing, accompanying, not leading. The ancient Nords would approve of this thinning. They believed that when guidance fades naturally, it has done its work, and so we remain here, present without momentum, allowing the world to continue in its own way without urging it toward meaning or conclusion. When remaining becomes indistinguishable from the world. At a certain depth, remaining no longer feels like an action. It feels like the world continuing through you. The ancient Nords did not describe this state because description implies separation. They understood it as the point where the boundary between self and place thins enough that effort, intention, and environment begin to overlap. Not merge completely, but align so closely that friction disappears. Skyrim holds people here, not by drawing them inward, but by ceasing to push them outward. There is no sense of being held, only a lack of resistance. Movement happens because it fits. Rest happens because it is timely. Choice arises without debate. This is the quiet integration the ancient Nords trusted more than identity. Identity requires maintenance. Integration sustains itself. When integrated, a person no longer asks whether they belong. The question stops forming. Belonging is replaced by attunement, a responsiveness that does not need affirmation. You notice what the day requires. You do it. You stop when it is done. Nothing is added. Nothing is missing. Skyrim rewards this attunement subtly. Paths feel clearer. Effort feels proportional. Consequences feel fair.
even when they are difficult. Fairness here does not mean kind. It means consistent. What you give meets what you receive without surprise. The ancient Nords believed surprise was the true enemy of peace. Not danger, not hardship, but outcomes disconnected from action. By shaping a world where cause and effect remain legible over time, they reduced shock. Reduced shock preserved composure. Preserved composure allowed learning to continue even under strain. This legibility is still present. You can feel it when you choose to wait and the waiting proves useful. When you choose to move and the movement carries you just far enough. When you stop pressing and discover that what you wanted arrives anyway, altered but workable. These moments teach without instruction, and because they arrive repeatedly, they accumulate into trust. Trust in timing, trust in restraint, trust in the sufficiency of small, correct actions. The ancient Nords built this trust slowly through centuries of adjustment. Once established, they stepped back, knowing that a system built on trust cannot be managed directly without damage. Trust collapses under supervision, so they removed themselves from the center. This is why there is no final authority in Skyrim. Not truly. Kings come and go, councils shift, laws change, but beneath all of it, the land continues to respond in the same way it always has. It does not judge intentions, it measures alignment. This measurement is quiet, patient, and cumulative. A single misstep rarely ruins anything. A pattern of misalignment eventually reshapes circumstances. This gradual response prevents panic and encourages reflection. Reflection, the ancient Nords believed, was the only reliable path to correction. Forced correction breeds resentment. Gradual feedback breeds understanding. Thus, Skyrim teaches slowly enough that learning feels self-directed. At this depth, the story itself becomes almost unnecessary. It has carried attention to a place where attention can rest on its own. Continuing to speak risks interrupting a process that no longer needs narration. And yet the voice remains a moment longer, not to conclude, not to instruct, but to acknowledge the threshold we have reached, a place where remaining feels natural, where movement feels unforced, where understanding feels embodied rather than articulated. The ancient Nords would recognize this as completion without closure. They would not mark it, they would let it be. The quiet that remains. Nothing closes. That is the last thing to understand. When the ancient Nords finished their work, the world did not change its shape. Mountains did not bow. The sky did not clear in recognition. There was no moment that could be pointed to and named as completion. Life continued, as it always had, only less strained. This is how they knew they were done. They had not built a legacy that demanded remembrance. They had built a way of living that no longer needed explanation. The land carried it now. The weather enforced it. Time confirmed it. Skyrim did not become peaceful. It became settled. Settled enough that effort fit inside it without friction. Settled enough that loss could be held without collapse. Settled enough that endurance no longer had to announce itself as strength. The ancient Nords faded without regret because there was nothing left to protect. What mattered could no longer be broken by forgetting. It existed as posture, as pacing, as the quiet agreement between action and consequence. They trusted this agreement more than words, and so the stories loosened, the names thinned,
The need to speak diminished. What remained was not silence, but room. Room for snow to fall without meaning. Room for fire to burn without symbol. Room for people to arrive, adapt, and decide for themselves whether to stay. This is the highest mercy a culture can offer its future. Not instruction, not authority, but a world that responds honestly. Skyrim responds honestly. It does not rush you. It does not trap you. It does not persuade. It waits. And waiting, when done without demand, is not emptiness. It is trust. The ancient Nords placed that trust in the land, and the land accepted it. The story ends here, not because there is nothing left, but because nothing more is required. What continues does not need to be said. It only needs to be lived.